And then he withstood this garrison of Philistines, and he wasn't going to move. And so I think he was one of the 37 mighty men of King David. And we're going to be talking today about dedication in Hanukkah and about being men and women of valor today. And so if you can hold your scriptures up, I'm going to say the blessing. Baruch hu Adonai hamvarak. Baruch hu Adonai hamvarak. Baruch hu Adonai hamvarak le'olam vayed. Blessed be the Lord God, King of the universe. Thank you for your word, the Torah. In Yeshua's name we pray. Amen. You can be seated. Thank you. So, Amy and I will be giving a teamwork word today on Hanukkah and dedication. And one of the things, too, we encourage questions, too. There'll be certain times during the teaching where we like input from you, and this is a classroom like a rabbi opens his teachings to, and so we're here to look at the scriptures and discuss it and study and meditate.
Well, good morning. Shabbat Shalom. Look at you guys responded right away. So we're, of course, going to talk to you a little bit about the story of Hanukkah, not only the things that came up to it that led to Hanukkah, but the things that followed the story of Hanukkah. How many people here like history? How many people here hate history? Okay, well, you're going to have to suck it up for 45 minutes. It'll be okay. So how many of you have heard of the Maccabees? Okay. Now, how many of you have heard of the Hashimoans? Okay. So if you heard of the Maccabees, you've heard of the Hashimoans. Okay. So Maccabees is kind of the term of affection that is assigned to the Hashimoan family. So Maccabee basically means like hammer, so they called them hammers, but their family name was Hashimoan. I say all that because I often refer to them as Hashimoan, not Maccabees, and I don't want you to get lost. So if I say Hashimoan, I'm referring to the Maccabean family, okay? It's all the same thing. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the history and the backstory of the things that led up to Hanukkah, and I'm just going to dive right in because there's a lot. So the first part, you guys probably know that in the beginning, the Persians, took over control of the land of Israel. Then the Greeks came in and defeated the Persians, and they assumed control over Israel. And what happened under the Greek rule was a man named Alexander the Great was ruling over the land of Israel. And actually, things were kind of okay under Alexander the Great. Jewish history is actually very, very friendly to Alexander the Great. They say that he was a friend of Israel, that he thought greatly of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So things were okay. I mean, you don't want a foreign ruler, but if you're going to have one, Alexander the Great is not the first. But then he had to go and die. So that didn't work out great. Alexander the Great, his empire was divided into a bunch of segments. And the segment that ruled over Israel was called the Seleucid dynasty. So sometimes you'll see it's the Greeks, it's the Seleucids, it's all the same, okay? That's just kind of the smaller segment of the greater Greek empire. And when you're studying this, it can get kind of confusing because there's several Antiochus, the name Antiochus in Seleucid history in their dynasty. But the first Antiochus that kind of made things not so great for the Jewish people in the land of Israel was Antiochus III. He really began a pattern of trying to slowly Hellenize the Jewish people. He wanted anything that was too Jewish kind of toned down a little bit. If it looked familiar to Greek culture, it was totally fine. But he wasn't interested in killing all the Jews. He was really more interested in the Jewish people kind of assimilating to Greek culture. But then he had to go and die. And his son, Antiochus Epiphanes, who you guys I'm sure have all heard of, he takes over. And he continues his father's strategy, but he actually takes it up a notch. And he starts outlawing, hard word for me, certain aspects of Jewish practice and Jewish faith. And they instituted some things that would allow the Jewish people to still kind of practice Judaism, but also kind of not. And it was very strategic. The Greeks were smart. They knew if they went in and said, you can't do anything Jewish, you're going to do all Greek things, you can't do anything Jewish, that everyone would rebel, everyone would take up arms and fight, and they would have to spend all kinds of military strength and strategy and men and resources to try to quell the revolt. So instead, they employed the boil the frog technique. If you're not familiar with the boil the frog technique, the question is...
Frog in the kettle.
Yes. How do you boil a frog? Now, I don't know why anyone would ever want to boil a frog. That's definitely not kosher. But the boil the frog technique says if you put the frog in a pot of boiling water, it'll just jump out. So you put the frog in water that's comfortable, water that it likes, and you slowly turn the temperature up until pretty soon the frog is boiling and the frog doesn't even know it. The Greeks were the master of the boil the frog technique. They would come into a nation and get the nation to give up just enough. They would start to change the people from the inside out, and they would eventually all assimilate to Greek culture. And if you doubt me on that, look at our world today. We are a very Greek-minded culture, even today. So they accepted all the social parts of the people of being Jewish. It was completely fine to be a social Jew. They just looked to kind of throttle down the religious parts. And you see that today, right?
It's the little foxes that spoil the vines, right?
Absolutely.
The little things.
America in general is perfectly fine with people having different cultural backgrounds. It's welcomed, it's encouraged. People like a little spice, right? We like a little bit of diversity, different viewpoints, different ideas in American culture. However, we only like it a little bit. And I'm not talking about here, I'm talking like our nation, right? Okay. We don't mind if people are Jewish. They can celebrate Hanukkah, they can have Passover, but if they really hold to their Jewish ideas, then they're a fanatic. The Orthodox Jews living in New York today have a much different experience with the outside world than the social Jews in New York. The Orthodox Jews are attacked on the streets and nothing's really said. The Orthodox Jews in New York had a horrendous treatment during COVID, and rules applied to them that was not applied to the rest of the world. They're fanatics, so we need to tone it down a bit. Even today, New York is currently going after the yeshivas in New York. Not going after everybody else, going after the art schools who you get an A because you painted a stick figure. They're going after the yeshivas. But the same thing is happening with Christians, right? We don't mind if people are Christians, but if they really hold to their Christian ideas, that they're a zealot, we don't like them. If an actor comes out and says they're pro-life, career done, over. Cancel culture starts coming in. And it's really at the point now where people are rather silent about their beliefs because they're afraid their careers are going to be impacted and they don't want to lose friends. So there's nothing new under the sun. This is a Greek idea from 2,000 years ago. The Greeks, like our modern society today, will accept all faiths, all cultures, all tradition, as long as you keep it low key. Bring your food, bring your music, bring your fun clothes, keep your faith to yourself.
And you can see that in Scripture with Mars Hill. They had all those different idols, including the god of the unknown God. All that stuff was mixed in the marketplace.
So the Greeks came in and they instituted a few rules. One of the rules was that the children weren't allowed to be circumcised. Another rule was that you weren't allowed to study Torah. And this is actually where the Haftorah came into being. So the rabbis got together and said, well, if we can't study Torah, what are we going to do? So they looked at the rest of the Tanakh, and they looked for passages within the rest of the Tanakh that related to what would have been the Torah portion that week. So that way you could openly study the Haftorah portion and get a hint and a feel and a flavor, and you could kind of sneak in Torah study without being thrown into jail. And that's where the dreidel comes into play at Hanukkah, because what they do is they will play their dreidel game when there were people around, but really the dreidel game was a cover for studying Torah. So even when all this nonsense ends, the Haftorah portion, because it worked out so well with bringing the scriptures in together, it stuck around. So that's where that idea came from. So the Greeks outlawed circumcision, they outlawed Torah study. They insisted that the Jewish people desecrate Shabbat in some way or form, working on Shabbat, something to do to desecrate Shabbat. They insisted that the Jewish people not keep kosher. They would also, if you were a religious Jew who believed in the sanctity of marriage, they would desecrate virgins. So it was a rule that if a Jewish woman who was a virgin was about to get married, she had to visit a Roman soldier first. And he would make sure she wasn't a virgin when she was married. It was awful. So as long as you went along with these things, if you weren't a very religious person, you didn't particularly care about the sanctity of Shabbat, you were okay with a ham sandwich every now and then, you didn't pick up to study the Torah anyway, your life was completely fine under Greek rule. It might have even gotten better. If you were someone that did all of these things anyway, you had a few girlfriends, you had a few boyfriends, you liked your ham sandwiches, and you got your overtime on Shabbat, your life was good under Greek rule. You were probably going to get promoted. And there were Hellenized Jews at this time that were really happy to see these changes. They got rewarded for their support of the Greek Empire. And that's the point I don't want you to miss. That as awful as these times were, life was good for those that were willing to go along with the Greeks. The Greeks weren't going to bother them. They didn't care. They could live a good, prosperous life. And that's what happened for a lot of Jewish people. In fact, there's stories, and I think rabbis talked about them before, that the Jewish men would want to participate in the wrestling events, but that was naked, and they would see that they weren't as Greek as they pretended to be, so they would try to reverse their circumcisions using...
Let's not get too graphic here.
Yeah. Use your imaginations. Pulleys, levies, that sort of thing. It wasn't great. But you could live a socially Jewish life and be just fine. Your life could actually look pretty different from Greek life. You could get up in the morning, eat your bagels, go to morning prayer, do your Haftorah study, and as long as you had a ham sandwich every now and then, you worked on Shabbat every now and then, you lived a great life. And you probably looked pretty Jewish to the Greeks. But the Greeks knew if you gave up a little bit of your faith, just a little bit, eventually you'd give up all of your faith. And eventually there would be no difference between the Jews and the Greeks. However, if you were religious, your life was unimaginable. Sorry, it's dry. The horrors that they inflicted on the Jewish people who chose to stand, Rabbi just talked about, were beyond imagination. I'm going to tell you a rather famous story within Judaism, but I'm actually going to tone it down quite a bit because if you read the original events, it's actually quite horrid. And it's the woman with 7 sons. I don't know how many of you heard this story, but it's often told at Hanukkah. There was a woman with 7 sons, and Antiochus and his army came to her and told her and the 7 sons that they needed to bow down before an idol. And they refused. The soldier took the oldest son and brutally tortured him in front of his mother and his remaining 6 sons until he said he would bow down. He refused, and they murdered him. And then they went from the oldest child down, brutally torturing each son in front of the mother until they got to the youngest. And I'm going to read actually from 2 Maccabees on this because it's just, I can't do it justice. I'm just going to read it. And Maccabees, by the way, is not canonized scripture, but all cultures, secular, religious, recognize Maccabees as a true and accurate historical event, okay? So whether, just be okay with me reading Maccabees. So this is 2 Maccabees 7, and this is referring to the woman. Filled with a noble spirit that stirred her womanly reason with manly emotion, she exhorted each of them in the language of our ancestors with these words: I do not know how you came to be in my womb. It was not I who gave you breath, nor was it I who arranged the elements you are made of. And she's speaking to her son here. Therefore, since it is the creator of the universe who shaped the beginning of humankind and brought about the origin of everything, he, in his mercy, will give you back both breath and life, because you now disregard yourself for the sake of his law. Antiochus, at this point, is suspecting insult in her words and thought he was being ridiculed. As the youngest brother was still alive, the king appealed to him, not with mere words, but with promises to make him rich and happy if he would abandon his ancestral customs. He would make him his friend and entrust him with a high office. When the youth paid no attention to him at all, the king appealed to the mother, urging her to advise the boy to save his life. After he had urged her for a long time, she agreed to persuade her son. She leaned over to him and said, in defiance of the cruel tyrant, she said in her native language, "Son, have pity on me, who carried you in my womb for 9 months, nursed you for 3 years. I brought you up, I educated you, and I supported you to your present age. I beg you, child, to look at the heavens and the earth and see all that is in them, and know that God did not make them out of existing things, the same way humankind came into existence. Do not be afraid of this executioner. Be worthy of your brothers and accept death. So in the time of mercy, I may receive you again with your brothers."
Now I know why she said that, and I didn't read it, so.
I'm going to read from there.
Okay, what's that? Okay. All right. Then she had scarcely finished speaking when the youth said, quote, "What is the delay? I will not obey the king's command. I obey the command of the law given to our ancestors through Moses. But you have contrived every kind of evil for the Hebrews. They will not escape the hands of God. We indeed are suffering because of our sins. Though for a little while our living Lord has been angry, correcting and chastising us, he will again be reconciled with his servants. But you wretch, most vile of mortals, do not in your insolence, B-U-O-Y, buoy yourself." Any sailors out there? "Do not buoy yourself up with unfounded hopes as you raise your hand against the children of heaven. You have not escaped the judgment of the Almighty and all-seeing God. Our brothers, after enduring brief pain, have drunk of never-failing life under God's covenant, but you, by the judgment of God, shall receive just punishments for your arrogance. Like my brothers, I offer my body and my life for our ancestral laws, imploring God to show mercy soon to our nation, and by afflictions and blows to make you confess that he alone is God. Through me and my brothers, may there be an end to the wrath of the Almighty that is justly fallen on our whole nation." At that, the king became enraged and treated him even worse than the other sons, since he barely resented the boy's contempt. Thus he too died undefiled, putting all his trust in Adonai. Last of all, after her sons, the mother was then put to death.
So there's lots of stories along these lines. Anyone that dared stand was persecuted, publicly tortured, and killed. There were small acts of defiance that happened. There was even a small revolt, but it only made Antiochus get more heavy-handed. He went in and desecrated the temple. You guys know the story. He brought in the pig's blood. He set up false gods in the temple. He stopped the daily offering, and he started outlawing more and more Jewish faith practices. There's a story where he found women who had got their children circumcised in defiance of the king's order. And he murdered the babies. He hung them around the mothers' necks and made the mothers parade through town. So it is an absolutely horrid part of history here. But then he met the wrong people, or maybe the right people. He sent officers into a city with the intent of forcing the people to sacrifice to their Greek gods. And he had done this. He'd gone from city to city and done this. And most cities he went into, the people did it. They agreed to participate. So he goes into the city of the Maccabees. The Maccabees at this time were set up as, they were priests, right? And they were the leaders of that particular city. So the city, so the soldier calls out to Matthias because he's a priest and the leader, and he promises him wealth and power if he's the first to participate. Will you read that?
But Matthias answered in a loud voice, although all the Gentiles in the king's realm obey him, so that they forsake the religion of their ancestors and consent to the king's orders, yet I and my sons and my kindred will keep to the covenant of our ancestors. Heaven forbid that we should forsake the law of the commandments. We will not obey the words of the king by departing from our religion in the slightest degree. As he finished saying these words, a certain Jew came forward in the sight of all to offer sacrifice on the altar in the Modin, according to the king's orders. When Matthias saw him, he was filled with zeal. His heart was moved, and his just fury was aroused. He sprang forward and killed him upon the altar. At the same time, he also killed the messenger of the king who was forcing them to sacrifice, and he tore down the altar. Thus he showed his zeal for the Torah, just as Phinehas did with Zimri, son of Salu. And whenever you guys remember Phinehas also, whenever Balaam had gotten everybody into sin, and then the righteous Phinehas took the sword whenever the couple there. So.
Yep, and he was a descendant of Phinehas, by the way. So after this event, a bunch of religious Jews actually went and hid in caves in the mountains. But then the Greeks found out that they were there, and so they strategically set out to attack them on Shabbat. And this particular group really wasn't sure what to do about defending themselves because it was Shabbat. And ultimately, the Greeks came in and slaughtered everyone in the cave. Not one of them survived. So after this, Matthias said that if we are attacked on Shabbat, we are going to defend ourselves. This decree not only saved the people in that time, but 2,000 years later, when Israel was attacked on Yom Kippur, the people knew. They didn't hesitate. They grabbed arms and they defended themselves. So this decree that he issued not only saved the lives of the people around him, it saved thousands of Jews 2,000 years later.
Now you know the rest of the story.
Funny. So after this, there was a lot of guerrilla warfare between the Hashimoneans and the Seleucid Empire. And the thing that you need to understand is that Greek Empire at that time was extremely powerful. It was said to be the most powerful empire in the world at that time. They had tens of thousands of troops at their hands, and they outsourced more. While the Maccabeans were just a handful of rebels. That's it. The miracle that we celebrate at Hanukkah, of course, is the restoring of the temple, the restoration of the temple. That happened actually 3 years to the day that Antiochus Epiphanes had slaughtered the pig and splashed the pig's blood in the altar. That happened 3 years to the day. And in fact, it was some thousands of hundreds, maybe years later or earlier, that the Mishkan had also been completed on this day. So when we celebrate Hanukkah, it's a very prophetic day in Jewish history. So when they went in, you know the story, they went into the temple and they only had one bottle of kosher oil. But what you may not realize is there was actually lots of oil in the temple, but there was only one bottle that they knew was still sealed and was undefiled. There were other bottles, but the seal had been broken. And they could have easily said, well, we're just going to burn these bottles. We don't know. Maybe they were just opened. Maybe they were defiled. Maybe they weren't. Let's just get the menorah lit. But they didn't. They said, we're not going to compromise one bit. We are only going to use the kosher oil. There's a proverb in Jewishness, and it's not from Proverbs, it's not a capital P proverb, it's a little p proverb, right? And it says, you are not required to complete the task, but neither are you allowed to desist from it. It's from the Ethics of the Fathers, which has tons of proverbs in it, and some of them are really funny. But this is the spirit in which they lit the Hanukkah. They said, we don't know if we can complete this. We don't know if we can have this menorah last for as long as it's going to take to get more oil. But we're not allowed not to try. We have to try. If it doesn't get completed, it's not going to be because we didn't try. So they did. And you know how it ends. The menorah lasted all 8 days, enough time for them to make more oil. But it also was significant because it matched the coat, which is also about dedication. So it's very profound, it's very prophetic. But what a lot of people think is that's where the story ends. It actually doesn't. It continues for years. The miracle of Hanukkah happened just a few years into the Maccabean revolt, but the war actually continued for 30 more years. It was 30 years before the Maccabeans were able to break off the yoke of the Greek army. And what you need to understand is that this successful revolt by the Maccabeans was absolutely world-changing. You can find accounts of this revolt in Egyptian history, Roman history, Greek history. It's very well documented. It's not considered a myth. It's considered historical fact. It is said to what turned the tide from the Greeks to the Romans was because of this revolt. It's the most on the map, world recognized and documented miracle, the war, event in Jewish history. So why is it not listed in the canonized version of our Bibles? Why, when the rabbis got together to decide what's to be included and what's not to be included, which there was a lot of debate, like the Book of Esther almost didn't make it, the Book of Lamentations almost didn't make it. Why did they exclude the Book of Maccabees? I mean, it's a world-changing event that everybody recognized, and they didn't include it. Why do we recognize the miracle of the oil, which was only 3 years into the revolt, but we don't do anything to recognize the world superpower being defeated by a small band of Jewish priests, who, by the way, priests at this point weren't even supposed to be in the army. They weren't supposed to be around defiled bodies, but they said, you know what, you guys aren't doing it, we will. So why aren't we recognized it? We have this small group of Jewish priests overthrowing the yoke of the world superpower, and we don't do anything to recognize this war at Hanukkah. To understand that, we have to understand what the Maccabean revolt was and what made it successful, which sounds a little backwards. Roll with me. The events of Hanukkah were in essence a fight for the right to be zealous for God. The Greeks wanted the Jewish people to give up their faith bit by bit until they were assimilated. The author of the Book of Maccabees puts it this way. He says, the war was between those who believed in God and his covenant and those who didn't. And by the way, he included Hellenized Jews in that later category. But had it just been a cultural war, I don't think it would have been as successful. The early Maccabeans were successful because they believed in the promises of God. They believed in the promise of ultimate redemption. The woman with the 7 sons referred to it, didn't she? What is the ultimate redemption? Messiah, right? Yeah. They carried the light of messianic hope into this culture war. They had this dual reality of waging war for their culture and the right to celebrate God, the right to obey his laws, to do his mitzvot, do his commandments, to sacrifices, obey Torah, all of that, while also carrying the light of the torch, the light, the torch of messianic hope, the hope of redemption. That is what made them successful. Here's how I know this. Here's how I know this. It was different than the future generations of Hashimoan. The future generations of Hashimoan did not carry the light of Messiah in their war. They didn't carry that hope of redemption, but they did continue to wage war. The first few generations within the Hashimoan dynasty were righteous men of God. We all know these guys, right? Later generations, not so much. By the end of the revolt, the family had gained a lot of prominence and notoriety, and their family was actually, at this point, the high priest. There is one high priest called Alexander Yanni. Has anybody ever heard of him? Okay, I'm going to give you a little story. Alexander Yanni had inherited the role of high priest from his brother. He fought the foreign oppressors. He waged war against those who would seek to overtake Israel. In fact, under Alexander Yannis's rule, Israel gained back most of its land. Under his rule, the Jewish nation was the strongest and largest it had been since the biblical rulers that we read about. So one could argue that he was waging a culture war by keeping the identity of the Jewish people and the Jewish state alive. But did he? No, he didn't. By this time, the Hashimoans had actually were doing everything that their great-grandparents had fought against. He actually caused a civil war within the Jewish nation. How many of you knew that there was a civil war within Jewish history? There was. Alexander Yanni was the high priest, and because prior to this, they had foreign rulers ruling over them, they had no longer had a king at the throne. Instead, they had governors, kind of like a head of state. They definitely weren't kings. I want to make that very clear. They weren't kings. They were sort of this government head of state person, right? The Hashimoans at this time served as governor and high priest, but that wasn't good enough. Alexander Yanni actually declared himself king and high priest.
So for a history lesson here, you always hear the statement, history repeats itself, right? So some of you might remember 2 Chronicles 26 about King Azariah confronting with 80 pastors, or 80 priests, I should say, confronting King Uzziah, who was going to be not only the king, but he was going to make himself the high priest. So again, history repeats itself, just like in this case.
Right. So you guys know that you're not allowed to be a king and a high priest. Major no-no. Well, the people knew it too. The Pharisees knew it. So the Pharisees and the people at that time rejected him. They said, "You're not king." "No, I don't think so," right? Well, the king didn't like that. And he basically ignored him and said, "Yeah, well, I'm king anyway." And the Sadducees and the Hellenized Jews were like, "Yeah, he's king." So there was a lot of tension between Alexander Yanni and the Pharisees and the general people. And so because he was high priest, there were certain ceremonies that he had to participate in that he didn't particularly like. One of them was the water pouring ceremony at Sukkot. Tom shared with us a video of a practice they did of the water pouring ceremony, and I can tell you it's just this wonderful, joyous ceremony that's done at Sukkot. There's singing, there's dancing, there's a parade of people. It is just such joyous, and it's just this volume of rejoicing in the air. And so Alexander Yanni, as high priest, is participating in this ceremony, carrying the pitcher of water, and they parading, and they get to the altar, and it's the part where he's supposed to pour the water over the altar. Except he doesn't. He's mad because he doesn't want to be there. He pours the water on his feet. The Pharisees didn't like him anyway, and now he goes and desecrates this. And they just conveniently happen to have a bunch of etrogs in their hands. So they hurled him at him. They pelted him with everything they had. Well, Alexander Yanni didn't like this particular act of defiance against him, so he went and hunt down 6,000 Pharisees that participated in this. and had them crucified. Now, what you need to understand at this point in Jewish history, people didn't crucify anyone in the land of Israel. They didn't crucify their enemies because the Torah says you don't hang a live person to die on a tree, right? He was the first person to crucify someone in the land of Israel. Not only was it a Jew that was the first person to do it, but he did it against his own brothers. And this was recorded actually in the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls refer to him as a man of wrath. And they don't mean that in a nice way. Well, because of this, there was a civil war that followed. There was tens of thousands of Jewish people that died in this civil war. And there's stories of him, again, crucifying people while he sat at a dinner table with his concubines that he wasn't allowed to have, eating while these people were crucified in front of their wives and children. So it was a very, very ugly time in Jewish history, and it was all internal. Eventually, the people fight back, and he agrees to renounce his title as this false king. So the Hashimoan dynasty improved a little after that, but not by a whole lot. So I told you all the bad stuff to get to the good stuff. Here's the part that gives me goosebumps. When the Hashimoans were originally put into power by the people, again, as heads of state, not kings, when they were put in as heads of state, they were set up as governors, that sort of thing. The reason they did that is because they knew they needed a Davidic king, but they didn't have one. But they knew they needed one. That is so profound. They were not giving up on the idea of a Davidic king, but they set them up as kind of placeholders. And here's what they said. It's recorded what they said when they set up the Hashimoans as governors. It said that the Hashimoans should lead forever until there should arise a true prophet. I'm going to repeat that. That the Hashimoans should rule forever until there should arise a true and faithful prophet who is going to point out who the true Davidic king is. Guess when the Hashimoan Empire dissolved? When John the Baptist stepped on the scene. John the Baptist, we know, is an immerser. We know him as the great, mikvah guy. But he was actually a prophet. Matthew 11 tells us what Yeshua thinks of Yochanan. Can you read that?
Verse 7, as they were leaving, Yeshua began speaking about Yochanan to the crowds. Quote, what did you go out in the desert to see? Reeds swaying in the breeze? No. Then what did you go out to see? Someone who was well-dressed? Well-dressed people live in kings' palaces. No. What did you go out to see? A prophet, yes. And I tell you that he's much more than a prophet. This is the one about whom the Tanakh says, see, I am sending out my messenger ahead of you. He will prepare your way before you. End of quote.
So do you see how prophetic their declaration was 200 years before? They wanted the Hashimoans to rule until a true prophet came along. So the Hashimoans are gone. They're dissolved. So the people are looking around for a true prophet to point the way to a true king. This is part of the reason Yochanan had so many followers. They were looking for him. The people were expecting him. And who did John the Baptist point to? He pointed to Yeshua to establish the Davidic kingdom. This is the scene that Yeshua steps into. It's an extremely tense time. They had just come off a civil war in recent history. There was a lot of tension still between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. You see Yeshua stepping into that mess. And there was a huge messianic expectation in the air. So Yeshua steps into the scene, and what does he do? He brings back the light of redemption. Yeshua comes with the same light that the original Maccabees had, the hope of redemption. He comes in with the same zeal of Torah that the Maccabees had. He points people to a greater observance of Torah, but he brings with him the hope of redemption. So why am I sharing all this? We are facing days that could very well be similar to the trials that the first generation of Maccabees had. And as Messianics, we probably feel this more than most. We feel that pressure all the time. Well-meaning, believing people challenge us all the time. How many times do you hear it? You don't need to keep Shabbat. You have Messiah. You hear that a time or two? You don't need to study Torah so much. You don't need to fast on Yom Kippur. You don't need to keep kosher. You heard that before? However well-intended, it is the same argument the Greeks made. It's the same argument. So this is where we stand firm, just as Rabbi talked about. In fact, I want to share a little bit of current events. This is some things that our community has participated in to stand firm, to spread the light. Would you bring up the first picture?
So here what we have, I don't know if you remember, in 2017 we were at our old location on South Main Street. We were right on actually the city border of Mansfield in Washington Township. And so there you have Rabbi pictured with the Washington Township trustee Bob Entenman, and also a representative from the Ohio Highway Patrol. Now, you might recall that in 2017 there were a lot of issues in our nation about religious persecution, and so in this situation, we had our first public display of a menorah. I used to go to the Sherman Room quite a bit in the Mansfield Public Library, and you could turn the next slide if you could. And so we looked at Jewish history in Richland County, and there's no record of an actual public menorah lighting in Richland County's history that we know of. We had 2 synagogues on Cook Road, but there's no record of that. And so Richland Source, Mansfield News Journal, WMFD, and Tribune Courier also were there that night at our old Shalom congregation on South Main Street, the building there. So, yeah, could you go back a slide there, actually? Could you go back another slide? So there you have, did we get the picture of the menorah, Rabbi lighting it?
Yeah, that's right there. You just can't see it.
There's another picture I had that, okay.
He's lighting it.
Well, okay. That's the front page there. So I had a picture that Tribune did, and it was a beautiful picture there. So if we could go to the next slide then. So then we ended up moving to Ontario, our current home location, and then our congregation had a public menorah display lighting on Ontario City property. And so in that situation there, we had our folks from last year that were there, a lot of familiar faces. It was 25 degrees that day, but we had, the key thing was we kind of made, it was the talk of the town whenever we had to present it to City Council. I walked in, and all the council members were saying they were concerned about what the ramifications were about having a menorah on property and what other unsavory groups might be allowed to come in. And so it was a big deal. But then it was just a joy to hear some of the council members say that, you know, hey, I did more research on Hanukkah I've never done before. I didn't know anything about it, and it is so powerful. And I stand behind the menorah and for religious freedom. And so it was really exciting, even on both aisles, no matter what political party it was. They were coming up to us afterwards saying that this is great for Ontario, and we wholeheartedly, we don't care, you know, what happens with other groups coming in. We want the menorah on display in Ontario. So that was encouraging. And we did the same thing in Lexington. So, but again, that menorah is about bringing light to a dark world. And so if you saw that front page, I don't know if you could see it from where your vantage point was, but all across the News Journal, they've, some guy gets 27 years for life sentence for murder, and then all the news around it is negative. But then to see Rabbi William lighting that menorah right on the front page is a front page to keep. So, but very prophetic. So, and then what we've done is, I don't know if we could go to the next slide then. So our community, not only are we a light inside, but also a light out to our community outside the 4 walls. And so I don't know if you knew this, but there was a reporter that did an article on North Central Ohio, and the headline of this article was, "Does anybody love Israel more than rural Ohio?" The reporter contacted us out of Nazareth.
Israel.
And, yeah, the land of Israel. And he wanted to do a story because he heard about what our congregation and other faith-based advocates in our community were doing about support of Israel. And so I don't know if you knew that we had the deputy speaker of the Israeli Knesset was here. He heard about what was going on, things like about how our county now invests in Israeli bonds. And it's interesting, Amy and I had a dinner with the Israeli bond representative. He came down and wanted to know what was going on, and he talked to our county treasurer, and so he heard about some of the things that you guys and what we're doing in our community. And we were at Cracker Barrel at 1371 there, and the exit 169, and he got teary-eyed because he's like, "Are you guys Jewish?" And we said, "No, we're not Jewish, but we've got a Jewish Kishka's Jewish soul." And he got teary-eyed. He's like, "You guys are doing more for Israel than I am." And he's like, "I want to do more." And he's employed by the Israeli Bond Federation. And so that happened. Well, then a year later, he did do more. We find out that he was able to get 32 counties to invest in Israeli bonds after Richland County, and that Richland County increased their bonds. And so he was all fired up, and then that made the Jewish news in Columbus and Cleveland and stuff, and that about Richland County also. So what you guys are doing and what we're doing together as a congregation is provoking people to that fire, that dedication that Hanukkah is all about. And so that's the story. Now you might be asking that question, what's that picture of? Well, it's interesting because you know how the Hanukkah is about freedom from tyranny. Well, in 2014, I attended the Richland County Board of Commissioners meeting, and we did a presentation requesting that the county commissioners do a proclamation on religious freedom, having a religious freedom day. Because I don't know if you recall, during 2013 and back then, pastors were going to jail for church bells in Arizona. You had Barack Hussein Obama's his legacy with going against Christian Judeo-Christian mindset and the foundations of our country. All that was going on, and so we decided we wanted a proclamation, the commissioners doing this. And so one of our key clergymen did a presentation as part of our whole presentation, talking about a initiative by the faith community, which Shalom was a part of, and it was called Light Our City. And at its peak, we had 45 congregations in North Central Ohio that were doing good deeds, mitzvot. And of course, we had Jews and Gentiles, but they were doing things like helping school tutoring, litter pickups, beautification projects, that type of thing. All this stuff, just to do good deeds and to be a light for our community, is light our city. And so he presented that to the commissioner board, and it's interesting that several days later, after that presentation, that was in January 2014, it was literally these pillars of light shown in Mansfield. And WJW Fox 8 covered the story out of Mansfield. I think it was WKYC also did a story on Mansfield. These pillars of light being seen all across the Mansfield area, North Central Ohio area. And they called it mystifying, and they called it a phenomenon. And they were saying that these meteorologists were saying, well, this phenomenon occurs only in certain situations, very rare, about how there's moisture, but no wind and freezing, below zero temperatures. Well, anyway, people, and this is, on Cleveland and Columbus News, pillars of light going from the ground, going up into the sky.
Like little menorahs all over the community.
And that's the first time the Richland County Commissioners ever declared Religious Freedom Day, was several days later. And so, so here you have these firsts, and the first menorah display in Ontario City, and then the first public menorah display, all these things happen. So that was kind of neat, and we're reminded in Daniel, that says, Daniel 12:3, where it says, you be the righteous lead many will be like stars in the sky, leading many to righteousness. And so signs and wonders should follow us wherever we go. And so that's just a neat example of our local history. And remember, we're reading, Amy's going through the Maccabean history. We have to remember, we have a history too.
Yes.
We have a culture.
Yes.
And that we're helping preserve our culture for the next generation that we see in the back. So that's very important. So there are so many things we could share about, but we've done a lot. Our faith community and rabbi with other clergymen are standing strong and faith leaders on this, and we're being like the Maccabees of old. And so now, and you could go into David's 37 men of valor and stuff like that. But we believe also that we've got a group of leaders here that are going to be strong, and we're seeing a national media fanfare and state coming to this area to write about what's going on.
Even internationally, Benjamin Netanyahu wrote a thank you letter to us for this, so personally signed it. So in the days of Hanukkah, they weren't fighting to stay Jew-ish. They could be a little Jew-ish. They could eat all the matzo ball soup they wanted, and they would have been left alone. What they couldn't be was zealous. That's where the Greeks drew the line. Same thing today. People are okay with you being a little religious, right? But zealous for God, for his commandments, not okay. The hidden warning of Hanukkah is that we have to be careful how we fight. It's good to fight back. That's why we want to share these examples, because we're not saying don't fight back. We need to stand, as Rabbi said last week. But if you don't hear this, or if you don't hear anything, don't miss this. If we don't carry the light of redemption, the light of the hope of Messiah, while we are fighting back, we're no different than Alexander Yanni. We will only create civil war. Rabbi actually demonstrates this all the time. People often come into our congregation because, they want to explore something a little different. And they bring their own theologies and ideas with them. And some of them are good, but some of them not so much. And you know what Rabbi does when these people come in with these strange ideas? He stands firm, but he's always kind. He always insists that people not be divisive within the body, but he's gentle and he's kind with them. There are a lot of Messianic congregations that if you don't agree, you're out. Rabbi doesn't do that. He lays out a path for them to see themselves. He shines a light. And we are really blessed to have that here, because not a lot of communities do. Yeshua talks a great deal about being a light. And we'd be here all day if we talked about them all. But I'm going to look at one example in Matthew 5. Can you read that? Right there.
Sure.
Yeah, put your eyeballs on.
That was good. Okay. Matthew 5:14. You are the light of the world. A town built on a hill cannot be hidden. Likewise, when people light a lamp, they do not cover it with a bowl, but put it on a lampstand, so that it shines for everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before people, so that they may see the good things you do and praise your Father in heaven.
So here, when the Messiah says that you shine the light and others will see it, what happens? It says they turn to God. They praise God, right, because of the things you do. But what does it mean to shine the light? What does that even mean? It's mitzvot, right? It's obeying his commandments. It's doing the things, not so we are saved. I'm going to repeat this for the people that accuse us of Judaizing. We don't do these things to be saved. Messiah saves us, that's it. Close the book, end of story, right? We don't do Torah to be saved. We do his commandments out of love for him, and get this, love for each other. Look how John puts it. Do you want me to read that? Or you could try both? Okay.
If someone has worldly possessions and sees his brother in need, yet closes his heart against him, how can he be loving God? Children, let us love not with words and talk, but with actions and in reality. 1 John 3:16-18.
Rabbi says this every week. Put your faith to your feet, right? So here's your Hebrew phrase of the day, kal vachomer. A kal vachomer means that if something matters with the small, it matters with the big, and vice versa. So if it matters that we take care of someone's worldly needs, right, how much more does it matter that we take care of their emotional needs? That we take care of their spiritual needs? Yes, we need to feed them, right? Listen, when you bring a food dish to a sick friend, you are shining the light of Messiah. When you put up a mezuzah for a friend, you're shining the light of Messiah. When you show compassion, you're shining the light of Messiah, the light and the hope of redemption. And I know he's talking about Torah when he says shining the light because of the next verse. We won't read the whole thing because we're running out of time. But it says in the next verse, if you want to put it up, he says, don't come to think that I have abolished the Torah. The next thing he does is start talking about the Torah. It's not an accident that he talks about shining the light and then he starts talking about Torah. The Torah teaches us what kindness is. It teaches us how to treat each other. The Messianic light is a light that points to redemption. It's the light that says a Redeemer will come. I bawl my eyes out every time you guys do the Mashiach song. You guys are all jumping for joy, and I'm bawling my eyes out in the back like a baby, ugly crying. Because during that song in English, what it says is, I believe with perfect faith, though he may tarry, I believe that he will come. That's the Messianic light. But it's also the light that says you can be redeemed today. It's the light that tells a hurting soul that they matter, that they're important. Yes, they matter to Messiah, but guess what? They matter to us, to the community. When people have the light, the hope of redemption, combined with the spirit of action that the Maccabees had, that Messiah had, it's more than a flame. It's a fire. This is the spirit of Hanukkah. It's action with light. Think about how we light the Hanukkah. During the miracle, we had the whole menorah lit, right? They didn't light just one stem. They light the whole thing. But during Hanukkah, we light one, and then the other, and then the other. One day, then two on the next day, and three. We don't light the whole thing. There's a message in that. We're supposed to start small and build and build and build until we have the full light showing. The small light matters. There's an idea in Judaism that says we have no idea what the big commandments are or the small commandments. Because in Torah, there's this odd little commandment that says you're not to take a mother's along with her chicks. Or you can't take the two together. The eggs. So it seems like a small commandment, but this commandment, unlike so many others, says if you do this, it's going to prolong your life. So the Torah is here to tell us you don't know what is small. Zechariah says, don't despise small beginnings. We may not be doing huge things. We may not be getting letters from Benjamin Netanyahu. We may not be lighting up menorahs in faraway places. But we don't have to do huge things. The small things even will light another light. And that lights another light until you have the full light of Messiah, of the Hanukkah showing. You may not think anything of being on the cleaning crew. You may not think anything of that meal you brought a friend, the kind word that you shared, or keeping kosher may even seem small to you. But these things are big. These are the things that could very well turn the tide for a lost soul. The Maccabees were small. They turned the tide. These things that seem small are the very things the Greeks wanted the Jews to give up. They wanted to convince the people that small things were small things and they were okay to give up until they weren't small things. So let's look at what happens when Yeshua demonstrates shining the light of Messiah with action. Just read this part.
Then came Hanukkah in Jerusalem. It was winter, and Yeshua was walking around inside the temple area in Shlomo's colonnade. So the Judeans surrounded him and said to him, "How much longer are you going to keep us in suspense? If you are the Messiah, tell us publicly." And Yeshua answered them, "I have already told you, and you do not trust me. The works I do in my Father's name testify on my behalf, but the reason you do not trust is that you are not included among the sheep. My sheep listen to my voice, I recognize them, they follow me, and I give them eternal life. They will absolutely never be destroyed. No one will snatch them from my hands. My Father, who gave them to me, is greater than to all, and no one can snatch them from the Father's hands. I and the Father are one."
So he goes on to say after this, he says, "You've seen me do many good works," right? He says in verse 37, if I'm not doing these good deeds, don't trust me. And then look what he says in verse 38. "But if I am then, even if you don't trust me, trust the deeds. Trust the things that you do," right? People may not trust religion, they may not trust the idea of a Messiah, but they'll trust you in the good things you do. This is what Messiah is saying. But look what happens afterwards. The people say, "Yochanan performed no miracles, but everything Yochanan said about this man was true, and many people put their trust in him." So I shared all of this to get to this one thing. We all have people in our lives who believe, right? But they buck against us for our beliefs, for our zealousness. We have to remember the message of Hanukkah, to stand strong and shine the light. So here's what I want everybody to do. Here's the interactive part. I want you to grab your cell phone. I know, it's okay, grab your cell phone. You're looking at me weird. I'm supposed not to have my phone. So the first thing I need you to do is mute your phone, because if we don't, in about 45 seconds, there's going to be all kinds of beeps and pings, and we don't want that. So I want you to think of that person that I just mentioned, that person that believes but thinks you're a fanatic zealot, okay? This person that you love. I want you to message that person just a quick word of encouragement and love, and I'm going to do the same thing. I'm texting someone who I know believes. They think I'm a little fanatical, and if I just dialed it down a bit, it'd all be okay, right? I'm just going to text one quick word of love to them, okay? So you guys do the same. Okay.
I'm getting all these texts now. I don't know what's going on.
Okay. There. That was it. You guys were just all a Maccabee. You guys all just did as the Messiah. Just like that, with one text, you combined action with the light of Messiah. Let's see what flames get lit from that. Shabbat Shalom.
Blessing.
Would you say a prayer and say a blessing over us?
Yeah.
Close us out.
Everybody stand, please. Yirakak Adonai varishmareka, Yir Adonai panav eleka vichuneka, Yisai Adonai panav eleka, V'esem lecha shalom. May I bless you and keep you and cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Lord and I turn his face towards you and grant you his shalom. Amen, amen. Be blessed. Shabbat shalom.
If anybody needs prayer and the prayer teams are here, feel free to come up. Have a happy Hanukkah, and we hope to see most of you guys tomorrow with hot chocolate.
4:45.
4:45.
Marshall Park.
Thank you. Shabbat shalom.